Good evening, all, and welcome to Lullaby Legends with Lack. I'm your host, Caleb Lack, and in each episode I tell one or two short stories for you to relax by, spanning the range from the dawn of civilization to the age of information. Tonight, I'm going to do things a little differently. And I'm going to tell some stories that have related themes instead of just from one particular place or time. So tonight's stories are going to be all about spiders. If you know much about mythology, you know that all cultures tend to have some pretty common themes that run through all of their stories. And one of the major themes that we see in a lot of stories are tales about spiders. And, as we'll see in a little bit, about tricksters. And sometimes the two are the same thing. So tonight's stories are all about spiders in one way or another. So sit back and relax, take a load off, and enjoy some stories. So, my first story tonight comes from Greek mythology, and this is the story of Arachne, the weaver. There was a young girl in Greece whose name was Arachne. Her face was pale but fair, and her hair was long and dark. All that she cared to do, from morning until noon, was to sit in the sun and spin thread. And all that she cared to do, from noon until night, was to sit in the shade and weave. And oh, how fine and fair were the things that she wove on her loom. Flax, wool, silk, she worked with them all. And when they came from her hands, the cloth which she had made of them was so thin and soft and bright that people came from all parts of the world to see it. And they said that the cloth was so rare that it could not be made of flax or wool or silk, but that the warp was of the rays of the sunlight, and the woof was of threads of gold. Then, as, day by day, the girl sat in the sun and spun, or sat in the shade and wove, she said, "In all the world there is no yarn so fine as mine, and in all the world there is no cloth so soft and smooth, nor silk so bright and rare." One afternoon, as she sat in the shade, weaving and talking with passers-by, someone asked of her, "Who taught you to spin and weave so well?" "No one taught me," Arachne replied. "I learned how to do it as I sat in the sun and the shade, but no one showed me." "But it may be that Athena, goddess of wisdom, taught you, and you did not know it." "Athena? Bah!" said Arachne. "How could she teach me? Can she spin such skeins of yarn as these? Can she weave goods like mine? I should like to see her try. I can likely teach her a thing or two." Arachne looked up and saw in the doorway a tall woman wrapped in a long cloak. Her face was fair to see, but stern, so stern. And her gray eyes were so sharp and bright that Arachne could not meet her gaze. "Arachne," said the woman, "I am Athena, the goddess of craft and wisdom, and I have heard your boast. Are you certain you still mean to say that you can spin and weave as well as I?" Arachne's cheeks grew pale, but she said, "Yes, I can weave as well as you." "Then let me tell you what we do," said Athena. 3 days from now, we will both weave. You on your loom, and I on mine. We will ask all who wish to come and see us, and great Zeus, who sits in the clouds, shall be the judge. And if your work is best, then I will weave no more so long as the world shall last. But if my work is best, then you shall never use loom or spindle. Do you agree to this?" "I agree," said Arachne. "Very well," said Athena, and she was gone. When the time came for the contest in weaving, hundreds were there to see it, and the great Zeus sat among the clouds and looked on. Arachne took her skeins of finest silk and began to weave. And she wove a web of marvelous beauty, so thin and light that it would float in the air, and yet so strong that it could hold a lion in the meshes. And the threads of warp and woof were of many colors, so beautifully arranged and mingled with one another that all who saw were filled with delight. "No wonder that maiden boasted of her skill," said the people, and Zeus himself nodded. Then Athena began to weave, and she took of the sunbeams that gilded the mountain top, and of the snowy fleece of the summer clouds, and of the blue ether of the summer sky, and of the bright green of the summer fields, and of the royal purple of the autumn woods. And what do you suppose she wove? The web which she wove was full of enchanting pictures of flowers and gardens, of castles and towers, and of mountain heights, of men and beasts, and giants and dwarfs, and of the mighty beings who dwell on the clouds with Zeus. And those who looked upon it were so filled with wonder and delight that they forgot all about the beautiful web which Arachne had woven. And Arachne herself was ashamed and afraid when she saw it, and she hid her face in her hands and wept. "Oh, how can I live," she cried, "now that I must never again loom or spindle?" And she kept on weeping and saying, "How can I live?" Then, when Athena saw that the poor maiden would never have any joy unless she were allowed to spin and weave, she took pity on her and said, "I would free you from your bargain if I could, but that is a thing which no one can do. You must hold to your arrangement, never to touch loom or spindle again. And yet, since you will never be happy unless you spin and weave, I will give you a new form so that you can carry on with your work with neither spindle nor loom." Then she touched Arachne with the tip of the spear which she carried, and the maiden was changed at once into a nimble spider, which ran into a shady place in the grass and began to merrily spin and weave a beautiful web. I have heard it said that all the spiders which have been in the world since then are the children of Arachne. Perhaps Arachne still lives and spins and weaves, and the very next spider that you see may be she herself. So that's the story of why we call people who are spiders arachnophobes, because the Greek word for spider is Arachne. So there you go. Those of you who are afraid of spiders out there, you're actually afraid of weavers who've been changed into spiders by goddesses, in case you didn't know. So, our second spider story tonight is going to come from Western Africa, particularly from the Ashanti people of Ghana. And this is the story of how their trickster god, whose name is Anansi, became a spider. There was once an African king who had the finest ram in the world. When this ram happened to be grazing on Anansi's crops one day, Anansi threw a rock at it, hitting it between the eyes and killing it. Anansi knew that the king would punish him for what he had done to the prize ram, and he immediately schemed how to get out of the situation. Needless to say, Anansi resorted to trickery, as always. Anansi went to sit under a tree and think of an escape when, all of a sudden, a nut fell and struck him on the head. Anansi immediately had an idea. First, he took the dead ram and tied it to the nut tree. Then he went to a spider and told it of a wonderful tree laden with nuts. The spider was delighted and immediately went to the tree. Anansi then went to the king and told him that the spider had evidently killed the prize ram. The ram was hanging from the tree where the spider was spinning webs. The king flew into a rage and demanded the death penalty for the spider. The king thanked Anansi and offered him a great reward. Anansi returned to the spider and warned it of the king's wrath, crying out to the whole world that the spider had killed the ram. The spider was very confused. Anansi told the spider to go to the king and plead for mercy, and perhaps the spider's life would be spared. Meanwhile, The king had gone home for lunch and told his wife what had happened. The wife just laughed and said, "Have you lost your mind? How on earth could a little spider make a thread strong enough to hold a ram? How in the world could that little spider hoist the ram up there? Don't you know? Anansi obviously killed your ram. By now you should know he is a trickster." The king was angry that he'd been deceived and told his court to fetch Anansi immediately. When the king's men came for him, Anansi assumed that it was to bring him to the palace for his reward for turning in the spider. So Anansi went along willingly. He walked into the palace as if he owned the place, and then said to the king, "Well, what is my reward for the killer of your ram?" This enraged the king so much that he kicked Anansi very, very hard, splitting him into 2 pieces. He was no longer a man, but was now a spider with very long legs. So that's why Anansi was often in the shape of, or form of, a spider, that trickster. So I've got one more story for you about Anansi, and then we'll be over for the night. So this is the story of how Spider obtained the sky gods' stories. Once there were no stories in the world. Anansi the spider went to Nyan Kanpan, the sky god, in order to buy the sky god's stories. The sky god said, "What makes you think you can buy them?" The spider answered, "I know I shall be able." After, the sky god said, "Great and powerful towns like Kokofu, Bekwai, Asumge have come, and they were unable to purchase my stories. And yet you, who are but a masterless man, you say you will be able?" The spider said, "What is the price of the stories?" The sky god said, "They cannot be bought for anything except Onini the python, Osibo the leopard, Mochia the fairy, and Imboro the hornet." The spider said, "I will bring some of all of these." The sky god said, "Go and bring them then." Anansi set about capturing these. First, he went to where Python lived and debated out loud whether Python was really longer than the palm branch or not, as his wife Aso says. Python overheard and, when Anansi explained the debate, agreed to lie along the palm branch. Because he cannot easily make himself completely straight, a true impression of his actual length is difficult to obtain, said Anansi. So Python agreed to be tied to the branch. When he was completely tied up, Anansi took him to the sky god. To catch the leopard, Anansi dug a deep hole in the ground. When the leopard fell in the hole, Anansi offered to help him out with his webs. Once the leopard was out of the hole, he was bound up in Anansi's webs and was carried away to the sky god. To catch the hornets, Anansi filled a container with water and poured some over a banana leaf he held over his head and some over the nest of the hornets, calling out that it was raining. He kindly suggested that the hornets get into the empty container, and when they obliged, he quickly sealed the opening, and then he took them to the sky gods. To catch the fairy, he made a doll and covered it with sticky gum. He placed the doll under the tree of life where the fairies play and put some yam in a bowl in front of it. When the fairy came and ate the yam, she thanked the doll, which of course did not reply. Annoyed at its bad manners, she struck it, first with one hand, then the other. Her hand stuck, and Anansi captured her. Anansi handed all the captives over to Nyan, the sky god. Nyan said, "Anansi, from today and going on forever, I present my sky god stories to you. My blessing, my blessing, my blessing upon you. No more shall we call them the sky god stories, but we shall call them the spider stories." This is my story that I've related. if it be sweet or if it be not sweet. Take some elsewhere and let some come back to me. That's all for tonight. I hope you enjoyed this story and that you will come back for more. If you have feedback, a suggestion, or a request, feel free to reach out and let me know. Good night, sleep tight, and don't let the Knocknitsa bite.